Thomas Reynolds, 72 years old, had lived the quiet kind of life that most people overlook, but that holds a beauty few truly understand. Harborside had been his home for decades, and there was a kind of unspoken rhythm to his days. Each morning, long before the sun lifted over the sleepy coastal town, Thomas would already be out on the water. His hands, worn, strong, and deeply tanned, would be guiding Liberty Child, the wooden boat he had lovingly built after returning home from Vietnam. That vessel wasn't just a boat, it was a piece of his soul, crafted with patience, grit, and quiet hope. In a town that had changed drastically, swallowed up by luxury developments and tourist influx, Thomas remained a living relic, respected by a few, overlooked by most, but oh, if only they knew the depth of his story. His boat, Liberty Child, was no pristine yacht. The paint had faded, bleached by 4 decades of salt, wind, and relentless sun. The wooden hull creaked and groaned with each shift of the waves, yet it was reliable, steady, built not just with nails and wood, but with purpose and healing. After the chaos and noise of Vietnam, Thomas had returned to his hometown and poured his pain into every plank and beam, silencing the echoes of war with the sound of hammer strikes and saws. The sea became his refuge, the boat his sanctuary. Most people didn't know much about his time in the Navy. He never talked about it, never needed to. They only knew he was a veteran. And sometimes, if you lived close enough to the harbor, you might hear him screaming at night. Terrible, raw sounds that cut through the stillness and made your skin crawl. He slept on Liberty Child often, anchored in solitude, and those screams would drift across the water like ghosts from the past. Still, no one asked, and he never offered. That Wednesday started like any other. Just before 5 in the morning, Thomas set out, his usual path marked by the rhythm of tide and routine. He planned to check his crab pots and then settle in his favorite spot near the harbor mouth, just in time to catch the sunrise. The water was calm, the world was quiet, but that peace was shattered in an instant. A deep mechanical throb cut through the stillness, the unmistakable sound of massive engines. Then she appeared, La Vita, the colossal luxury yacht gliding into the harbor like a gleaming, mechanical mountain. 600 tons of sleek Italian design, slicing through the water with an arrogant sense of entitlement. At the helm stood Jackson Reed, a tech mogul, only 38, fresh off the pages of glossy magazines and local newspapers. He'd recently bought the largest beachfront property in Harborside, and the town had hailed him as an economic savior. What a joke. Thomas recognized him instantly. Not from any conversation, of course, but from the articles praising him for bringing progress. Progress, huh? As if the town needed saving from men like Thomas. As the yacht approached, Thomas raised his arm, signaling his position. "Hey, I'm moored here," he called, voice straining against the roar of engines. But the yacht didn't slow. On the upper deck, Reed and his party toasted with champagne flutes, their laughter floating down, indifferent, or worse, amused by the small wooden boat directly in their path. A harbor security boat drifted nearby, its officer watching with visible concern. But no one moved, no one intervened. Then, impact. The sound was sickening. Liberty Child's stern exploded in a splintering crack, the heavy bow of La Vita crashing into her like a sledgehammer through glass. Wood shattered, screws popped. Thomas leapt, barely escaping, landing hard on the dock. His knees, riddled with arthritis, howled in protest. But worse than the pain was the sight of his beloved boat breaking apart beneath the monstrous vessel. The American flag he'd flown daily for 40 years tore free in the chaos, fluttering down into the foaming water. Its red stripes streaked through the sea like blood. Finally, La Vita's engines cut. Silence followed. Unnatural, eerie. And then Reed's voice rang out, clear and dismissive. "It's just an old fishing tub. Get over it." Get over it? Thomas stood there, his chest heaving, staring at the debris of everything he'd held sacred. A crowd had gathered. Tourists, joggers, locals, phones out, cameras up, but no one stepped forward to help. No one moved. The harbor security officer finally approached, eyes downcast. "Mr. Reynolds, I'll need to file a report." But Thomas didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the water, on the flag, torn and soaked, drifting away like a forgotten memory. Slowly, painfully, he moved down the dock, each step deliberate. He bent, ignoring the stabbing in his shoulder, and pulled the flag from the water. It clung to him, dripping, as he pressed it to his chest. Not a word escaped his lips, but the sorrow in his eyes screamed volumes. From the deck of La Vita, Reed sneered. "Nice boat. Maybe it's time to upgrade, old-timer. Everything has its expiration date." Thomas said nothing. He didn't dignify the insult with a reply. He simply gathered his flag, turned his back, and walked away, straight and steady, even as his hands trembled and his knees burned. Behind him, someone laughed. A phone chimed. The first video had gone viral before breakfast. Old man, old boat, old news. By noon, Harborside had returned to normal. The remnants of Liberty Child were cleared away like garbage, a problem tidily solved. People watched the video, laughed, shared it. Lowell. No one talked about the pain in the old sailor's eyes. No one asked what that boat had meant. Thomas returned to his cottage, perched humbly on a bluff above the harbor. He'd bought it years ago with his Navy pension, long before Harborside became a playground for the wealthy. Through that front window, he had watched his town transform, quietly, painfully, from a hard-working fishing village into a curated postcard destination. That evening, at his kitchen table, he opened a wooden chest filled with the echoes of a life in service. Faded photographs, yellowed commendation letters, dog tags worn thin by years at sea, and at the bottom, a second flag, still crisp, folded with military precision. It had been handed to him when he retired. His grandson Michael stood silently in the doorway, face tight with anger. "You're going to sue them, right, Grandpa? That guy destroyed your boat. He should pay." Thomas shook his head slowly, his fingers brushing the stars of the folded flag. "He didn't hit me," he said softly. "He only hit something nobody ever cared about." Michael frowned, his heart burning with injustice. "But you built that boat. It meant something to you." "Yes," Thomas agreed, a world of memory in that one word. "To me." Later that night, after Michael had gone to bed, Thomas opened his old logbook. Every day for 40 years, he logged the weather, the sea, the catch. That night, he wrote a different kind of entry. "First day without Liberty Child. No condolences offered, but I can still hear the water calling." He closed the book and turned on the television. The local news was celebrating Reed's yacht, the largest private vessel to ever dock in Harborside. Not a single mention of the morning's collision. Online, the video had racked up millions of views. Most comments favored Reed. That old was an eyesore anyway. Boomers need to retire. Get with the times. Later, the harbor master called. His tone was dry, professional. "Your vessel wasn't equipped with radar reflectors or modern navigation lights. It wasn't up to current standards. I'm afraid the insurance won't cover the loss." Thomas listened silently. He could have told him Liberty Child had been grandfathered in, that she had passed every safety inspection for 4 decades. But why bother? The sea had taken back what he had borrowed. That was its way. Still, as he stood on his porch that night, looking out over the harbor, the absence stung like a phantom limb. It wasn't just a boat that had been lost. It was the place where he found peace, where the war never reached, where dolphins danced in his wake and dreams were soothed by the ocean's lullaby. Across the harbor, La Vita was lit up like a city. Music pulsed. Laughter rang out. The rich and carefree partied on, while an old sailor mourned in silence. He didn't hate them. He'd seen enough of hate. But oh, how he wished they understood. What was lost wasn't just wood and nails. It was a way of life, a connection to something deeper, a respect for the sea, for history, for the quiet things. In the moonlight, Thomas unfolded his service flag and draped it over the porch railing, letting the wind carry it one last time. At dawn, he woke out of habit, reached instinctively for his boat keys. But the emptiness was vast, crushing. For the first time in 40 years, he had nowhere to go. He never asked for money. He never demanded revenge. But he deserved something, didn't he? Something simple, something sacred. Respect. If you believe honor can't be bought, type honor. Because men like Thomas Reynolds are fading into silence, and the world needs to remember what they stood for. That morning, fog wrapped Harborside in a soft, ghostly blanket. The sea, ever mysterious, held its breath. And Thomas sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hands, staring into the mist, still keeping sailors' hours, even with no boat left to guide. As the harbor foghorn sounded 3 long, resonant blasts, Thomas Reynolds sat up straighter, his instincts honed by decades at sea, immediately recognizing the signal. Large vessels were entering the harbor. The morning stillness was pierced by the deep, vibrating tones, stirring something deep within him. Through the thick mist, massive gray shapes began to emerge, cutting through the water with disciplined precision. 6 Navy ships in formation, their outlines sharpening as they approached, moved with a purpose that was both majestic and solemn. No announcements had preceded their arrival. No celebrations had been planned. Most striking of all was the silence. No horns, no signals beyond the necessary navigational requirements. On each vessel, the American flag flew at half-mast, a gesture of mourning and respect that sent a ripple of curiosity and reverence through the town. As word spread, townspeople gathered along the waterfront. Shop owners flipped their signs to closed and hurried to the docks. Children were released early from summer programs, their excited voices hushed by parents who sensed the solemnity of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand its cause. From his vantage point, Thomas watched with a mix of confusion and awe. No naval exercises had been scheduled. No dignitaries were visiting. There was no reason for this display of military presence in the small tourist harbor. The lead vessel, a guided missile destroyer, docked with precision. On the deck stood Rear Admiral James Nelson, his dress whites immaculate, his face composed in formal lines. In his gloved hands, he held a perfectly folded American flag, the triangle of blue and stars displayed with ceremonial care. Thomas felt a strange tightening in his chest. He knew that fold. He had performed it himself many times over his years of service. It was the fold given to honor the fallen, to recognize sacrifice. Slowly, painfully aware of his stiff joints and in his civilian clothes, Thomas made his way down to the harbor. The crowd parted for him without knowing why, sensing something important in his deliberate progress toward the assembled naval officers. Admiral Nelson spotted him and stepped forward, his salute crisp and formal. "Chief Petty Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent harbor. "Permission to come ashore and render honors?" Thomas returned the salute reflexively, the motion embedded in muscle memory despite the decades of civilian life. "Permission granted, Admiral," he replied, his voice steadier than he'd expected. The Admiral descended the gangway, followed by a formal color guard. The assembled sailors on all 6 vessels stood at attention, facing shore. 43 years ago, Nelson began, addressing the gathered crowd rather than Thomas directly, this man prevented a catastrophic failure aboard the USS Constellation when a cooling system ruptured during a storm in the South China Sea. He manually sealed the compartment, sustaining severe burns to 60% of his body. His actions prevented toxic gases from reaching the sleeping quarters, where 128 sailors lay unaware of the danger. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many turned to look at Thomas with new eyes, seeing for the first time the faint scars that traced his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. Chief Reynolds never spoke of his actions, the Admiral continued. He declined the Navy Cross, asking only that we take care of the boys who didn't make it home. He has lived among you for 40 years, asking nothing, expecting nothing. The Admiral's gaze swept the harbor, resting briefly on the gleaming yacht where Jackson Reed and several others stood watching. Yesterday, his vessel, Liberty Child, was destroyed in this harbor. No assistance was offered, no respect was shown. The flag he served under was allowed to sink. A young sailor stepped forward, carrying a wooden plaque. He approached Thomas and bowed his head respectfully before presenting it. Thomas looked down at the polished surface. It contained a brass plate from a decommissioned ship, engraved with the words, "For the man who kept the sea safe, even after service. The United States Navy does not forget its own." Admiral Nelson continued, "We have come to render honors to Chief Petty Officer Thomas Reynolds, and to acknowledge that his service did not end when he removed his uniform." All around the harbor, sailors stood at attention, saluting. The color guard raised their flags. In that moment, it wasn't just 6 ships that had arrived. It was the full weight of naval tradition and brotherhood. Someone in the crowd began live streaming the ceremony. Within minutes, the footage was spreading across social media platforms. The hashtag #BoomerDown that had accompanied yesterday's video of the boat collision rapidly gave way to "Veteran Salute." Commenters who had mocked the old man just hours before now scrambled to delete their posts, replaced by messages of respect and shame. "I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell us he was a hero? This is what real service looks like. Reed, watching from his yacht, had the grace to look uncomfortable. His guests had fallen silent, champagne glasses set aside as the ceremony unfolded. After the formal presentation, Admiral Nelson spoke privately to Thomas. "We heard about what happened from your grandson. Michael contacted the Navy Alumni Association. Why didn't you call us yourself, Chief?" Thomas shrugged slightly. "Not your problem, sir. It was just a boat." "No, Reynolds," the Admiral replied. "It was never just a boat, and you were never just a sailor." As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, a strange thing happened. One by one, townspeople approached Thomas, many for the first time in years, and offered their hands, their thanks, their apologies. The harbor master presented him with fishing permits for life. The owner of the local marina offered him a slip free of charge for whatever vessel he chose. Thomas accepted it all with the same quiet dignity he'd shown when his boat was destroyed. But to those who looked closely, there was a new light in his eyes, not triumph, but recognition. After decades of silence, he had been seen. 1 week later, a small dedication ceremony was held at Thomas's usual mooring spot. A simple stone marker now stood on the dock, Liberty Child, a boat that carried more than one life. The town council had approved it unanimously, with several members tearfully acknowledging they'd never known the true story of the quiet man who lived among them for decades. The harbor had changed in subtle but significant ways. Where tourists had once passed Thomas without a glance, they now paused at the memorial, reading the plaque that briefly outlined his service record. Local fishermen, who had gradually been pushed to the margins by pleasure craft, found themselves greeted with new respect. Most surprising was the change in the children. Where they had once been kept away from the old fishermen as irrelevant relics of a bygone era, they now gathered at the docks after school, eager to hear stories and learn skills that no app could teach. On this particular afternoon, Thomas sat on a newly installed bench facing his old mooring spot, demonstrating knot-tying techniques to a group of attentive children. His gnarled fingers moved with surprising dexterity, transforming simple rope into intricate patterns that had secured vessels through countless storms. "This one's called a bowline," he explained, his voice gentle. "Been saving sailors since before Columbus." A young girl named Lily, about 7 years old, watched with serious concentration as he guided her hands through the motions. "Are you angry at the man who broke your boat?" she asked suddenly, with the direct curiosity only children can manage. Thomas paused, considering her question with the same care he'd given to teaching her the knot. "No," he said finally. "If not for them, perhaps no one would remember that boat ever existed." The children absorbed this with solemn nods, understanding instinctively a wisdom that many adults had missed. Later that afternoon, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Jackson Reed stood awkwardly at the edge of the dock, designer sunglasses pushed up on his head, looking distinctly uncomfortable away from his usual entourage. 2 days after that unforgettable morning in the harbor, when the world seemed to pause and finally see the man it had long overlooked, something remarkable happened, something simple, quiet, yet deeply profound. A master woodworker arrived from Seattle, a man whose hands had shaped altars and heirloom furniture, and now he came to install a bench. Not just any bench. This was a hand-carved masterpiece made of teak, the kind of wood that lives and breathes with the sea air. It was placed precisely where Thomas had requested, overlooking the very spot where Liberty Child had once been moored. Inlaid in bronze were 3 simple words that would never fade, only deepen with time: for quiet courage. But here's what no one expected. Jackson Reed showed up too. Yes, that Reed. The same yacht owner whose recklessness had destroyed Thomas's boat. Gone were his sunglasses and smug grin. Instead, he worked alongside the carpenter in helping lift the heavy bench into place. His hands, usually soft and manicured, blistered and raw by the end of the day, but not a single complaint. Can you imagine that? It was as if he was trying to sand down more than teak, perhaps his own guilt, his own arrogance. And word of Thomas's humble response to Reed's offer, he had declined money, luxury, any kind of restitution, began to spread. Oh, it spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up first, but soon national outlets ran with it. Veteran declines fortune, requests memorial bench instead. Some commentators debated it endlessly. Had he been too forgiving? Was he a fool or a sage? But the ones who truly understood were the veterans. Across the country, VFW halls, veteran groups, and military pages online began to share the story. They knew this wasn't about pride or punishment. It was about legacy. It was about grace. Meanwhile, Thomas stayed the same. He avoided cameras, sidestepped interviews. The man who had once quietly filled the town's soup kitchen freezer with fish now spent his days giving something even more precious, his time. Teaching kids to tie sailors' knots, to read the weather in the clouds, to respect the ocean not for its beauty, but for its power and mystery. No longer was he the old man with a boat. He had become a bridge between generations, a living library of knowledge and integrity. Then, a month later, Admiral Nelson returned, not in full dress, not aboard a ship, but in a dusty civilian car and jeans. He found Thomas, as always, on the dock. They exchanged greetings, old sea dogs recognizing one another by instinct. And then Nelson said something that would change everything. "The Secretary of the Navy has a proposition for you." He laid it out, a youth maritime program focused on seamanship, navigation, environmental stewardship. They needed someone who knew both the ocean and how to connect with young hearts. Thomas chuckled. "I'm an old man, Admiral, not much use to anyone these days." But Nelson just laughed, gesturing to the pack of kids trailing behind Thomas every day like ducklings. "Tell that to them." Before Thomas could answer, a new sound caught their ears, the thrum of a small engine. A wooden boat was being towed into the harbor, gleaming like sunlight on polished oak. It looked familiar. So familiar. Could it be? On its stern, fresh paint spelled out a name that hit Thomas like a wave to the chest. Liberty's Child. Michael was at the helm, his face lit up with excitement. "Surprise, Grandpa," he shouted. "We all pitched in. I found your old plans in the shed." The whole town had helped. Materials donated by the Boat Builders Association. Veterans from 4 different states volunteering to bring it to life. It wasn't exactly the same. They'd added modern safety features, upgraded the navigation, but the soul, Michael said, was intact. "Your hands may not have built it, but your heart designed it." Thomas stepped aboard slowly. The deck rocked beneath him, but he didn't stumble. His sea legs were eternal. His weathered hand traced the rail. At the bow, a brand new American flag snapped proudly in the breeze. "For a man who kept faith," Michael said quietly, even when it seemed like no one was watching. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the harbor in gold and crimson, Thomas sat on the new bench, Reed's bench. He watched the fishing boats return, their bellies full with the day's catch. A young family stopped nearby. Their child pointed at the inscription. "What does that mean?" they asked. The father paused, then answered, "It means we should stop sometimes and think about the people who made our lives possible." Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just smiled, his eyes on the horizon, where sky and sea became one. In this frantic world where attention fades in seconds, where kindness is often swallowed by noise, he had become something rare, a reminder, a living tribute to steady hands, to quiet service, to courage that doesn't shout. His new boat would sail the same waters, not with grandeur or fanfare, but with purpose, carrying forward the same values, steadiness in storm, help freely given, quiet courage when required. He never demanded justice. He never raised his voice. He simply picked up the torn flag and walked away. But the sea remembered. Do you believe stories like this still matter? That honor isn't dead, that silence can still speak volumes? Then don't let this one be forgotten. Because once, when no one helped, when someone laughed and said, "It's just an old fishing tub, get over it," 6 Navy ships answered instead. Not with words, but with reverence. And maybe, just maybe, good deeds really do come full circle.